Welcome to the Language Fuel podcast. Our mission is to fuel the teaching and learning of languages worldwide. I'm your host, Joanna Smith. Hello and welcome to the Language Fuel podcast, episode number 18. Today I'm going to spend a little bit of time clarifying a few items of terminology that I've heard being used not quite correctly, and I've also seen on social media a few people asking about it, what's the difference between this and that. So this is all about pronunciation and the words that go with it. So phones, phonetics, phonology, allophones, phonemes, phonemic charts. What are they all and how on earth does it help us learn or teach language better? I hope you enjoy the podcast, and as always, for more information you can see us online at www.languagefuel.com. Let's take a minute to clarify a few key terms that you may have heard of before, as there does seem to be a lot of confusion out there. The terms I'd like to clarify are phones, phonetics, phonology, phonemes, allophones, phonics, and then finally the distinction between the phonetic chart and the phonemic chart. So phones, let's start there. In linguistics, phones are not telephones, they are language sounds. There are hundreds of phones that we as humans can make in any language. Phonetics is the study of phones, in other words, the study of human language sounds. Articulatory phonetics in particular studies how the human vocal tract makes those sounds. Acoustic phonetics is the study of sound waves created by language sounds, and this is particularly useful for applying linguistic understanding to computer programs, for example. Now, phonology, by contrast, is the study of sounds in one particular language system. While any language may use hundreds of individual phones, in actual fact, there are only a smaller subset of perceived sounds which individuals pay attention to. These perceived sounds, or technically groups of phones, are called phonemes. Now let me explain that a little bit further with some examples. English technically has about 40 phonemes. I say about because there are many varieties of English and some of them have different phonological systems. One phoneme in English is represented by the letter T, as in tiger. Now there are actually several ways to say this phoneme, and native speakers swap between these phones all the time. At the beginning of a word, most native speakers add a tiny little puff of air called aspiration. So if you were to put a hand in front of their mouth when they said tack or top, you would feel some air. As you are listening to this, you may even hear a little bit of hissing sound in the microphone. However, when you put an S in front of those words, the aspiration disappears and they use a non-aspirated T like stack or stop. Your hand in front of the mouth would not feel that puff of air. Now, if you're a native speaker of English, you're probably thinking right now, wow, that is such a tiny difference, and it really is not that important. And you'd be right, because in English, aspiration doesn't make a difference at all to our perception. So even if I swapped those sounds and said dack or top instead of tack and top, you might think I said something slightly funny, but you wouldn't really have a problem understanding me. Those two phones belong in the same phoneme category. In linguistic terms, we say that those two phones are allophones of the same phoneme. In the Thai language, however, the distinction between aspirated and non-aspirated stops is important. So, and I don't know Thai, so I'm not sure if this is a real word, but if you said tack instead of dak, you would be saying a different word altogether. So those phones would belong to different phonemes. They would not be allophones of each other. So in this way, technically speaking, a phoneme is a group of sounds, and those groups are different in each language. Usually for language teaching, it's sufficient to define phonemes as the important or distinctive sounds in a particular language. Moving on, let's talk about phonics. What is phonics? Phonics is the study of how a language's phonemes map onto the alphabet system. In a perfectly phonemic system, one alphabetic symbol would match one phoneme. English does not have a phonemic alphabet system. As I said earlier, there's about 40 different phonemes in English, but there are only 26 letters in the English alphabet. So, some alphabet symbols have two different phonemes associated with them. For example, the letter A could represent A or A depending on the word. And some phonemes have more than one way to spell them. The phoneme oo can be spelled with a letter U or with two O's next to each other. And sometimes a sound needs more than one alphabetic letter to represent it. So the sound th needs both the T and the H together to represent it. And even then it's problematic because the combination of letters T and H could represent th or its voiced partner th. So you can see how convoluted this all is, and this is why phonics training is so very important for people who wish to learn how to read and write in English. Without specific training, it just doesn't make sense. In other languages, however, such as the Nordic languages, Swedish or Finnish, their alphabets are in fact perfectly phonemic, or nearly perfectly phonemic. So there is a nearly one-to-one correspondence between a letter in the alphabet and the corresponding phoneme in the brain. And this is one reason why Nordic children have far fewer problems with spelling than their English-speaking counterparts. Now that you hopefully understand the difference between phones and phonemes, let's talk about the phonetic versus the phonemic charts. So the IPA stands for the International Phonetic Alphabet. And this is a system of symbols for representing any language sound, in other words, any phone. It's not language specific, and it's very precise. IPA symbols are written with square brackets around them to distinguish them from any particular language alphabet system. There are hundreds of symbols in the IPA, and it's quite a skill to be able to hear such precise phonetic differences and use the IPA symbols as they're designed. Articulatory phoneticians do this when they are researching new languages, for example, and designing writing systems for them. A phonemic chart, on the other hand, is a chart which summarizes all of the phonemes of a specific language. In other words, the number of important or contrasted sounds in that specific language. So the English phonemic chart that I use to teach English has 40 symbols. Phonemic symbols are written with slanted brackets, or maybe you could call them slashes. This distinguishes them from the language's writing system, in other words, the alphabet, and it also distinguishes them from phonetic symbols. So why does all of this matter for language teachers? Well, I think there are some important issues here. First of all, it definitely helps you to understand why students have trouble with pronunciation and, of course, spelling. Mature learners in particular have already cemented their phonemic system in their first language with its own groups of allophones. So they will have pre-associated certain sounds as quote-unquote the same, and they may have to unlearn certain associations between sounds. So for example, an English learner learning Thai has to unlearn the association between aspirated and non-aspirated stops and learn to control them in different environments. Or nasalized vowels, for example. In English, we don't make any distinction between them, but in French, there is a difference. I'm told the words bon and bo are very different, but to most English-speaking ears, they sound the same because we don't have separate categories for nasalized vowels. So any speaker learning French would have to learn to control this difference and create new categories of allophones and phonemes in their brain. The second reason is that many students have to create brand new sounds or learn sounds that they're just completely unfamiliar with to start off with. So for example, the sound U in French or German, upon the first hearing for an English speaker, we would assume it's a kind of an oo sound and we would want to categorize it in our phonemic box for oo. But we have to learn to create new categories for this vowel. Thirdly, it's really a fantastic skill for any language teacher to be able to use a phonemic writing system when teaching new vocabulary items, especially when they're teaching a language whose alphabet is not phonemic. And this helps students learn simply the pronunciation of the word as distinct from the spelling of the word. I would like to say, though, for those of you who are teaching young children, this may not be any issue whatsoever. Young children typically have not yet firmly cemented their phonemic categories, and they typically learn pronunciation to a native speaker level without much specific intervention from a teacher. But from about adolescence onwards, it does become hard for a learner to do this automatically, and specific teaching on these things is usually required. And the final comment I'd like to make is that these things require a lot of training, both in receptive training and distinguishing between sounds, and of course productive training. And yes, communicative language teaching techniques are extremely popular, and I think they're a fantastic way to learn languages. However, a skill like pronunciation, both receptively and productively, needs a lot of training, and sometimes drilling is appropriate until these things are clear. There will be more information coming in my course called Toolkit for Teaching the Sounds of Other Languages. We're also creating a parallel course on how to learn the sounds of other languages, and this is for adults who are learning a language in a self-directed manner, and they want to increase their understanding of the language learning process. Both of these courses are coming up soon, hopefully in March. If you would like to go on the mailing list to hear more about these courses, you can click on the button on this episode's homepage, which is at www.languagefuel.com/episode 18, and we'll also send you an infographic with a summary of all of these definitions. Thank you for listening to the Language Fuel podcast. You can navigate to the show notes and links via our homepage at www.languagefuel.com. See you next time.